The iron gates of Buckingham Palace, those towering symbols of British imperial might, have witnessed coronations, wars, and the quiet deaths of dynasties, but they have never witnessed anything quite like this. What unfolded in the private chambers of Windsor Castle at precisely 16 minutes past 1 in the morning was not a family reconciliation. It was a constitutional execution. The monarchy, that ancient and unyielding institution, has made its final calculation, and Prince Harry, the once beloved spare to the heir, has been mathematically removed from the equation of royal succession with the cold precision of a surgeon excising diseased tissue. This is not hyperbole. This is documented fact sealed in a 200-page legal instrument that reads less like a family decree and more like a corporate dissolution. King Charles III, standing in the shadow of his own mortality and the weight of 1,000 years of Windsor blood, has signed what palace insiders are calling Operation Heritage Reset. The language is clinical. The implications are catastrophic. The Duke of Sussex has not merely been distanced from the working mechanisms of the crown, he has been institutionally vaporized, his royal relevance reduced to the status of historical footnote, his children's claim to any semblance of Windsor heritage cauterized with legal finality. Consider the brutal arithmetic of power. For years, the public consumed the narrative of a wounded family seeking reconciliation, of a stern but loving father extending olive branches to a prodigal son. But behind the velvet curtains and within the paneled libraries of the royal residences, a different calculation was taking place. The monarchy was conducting a risk assessment, and Harry, with his unpredictable media interventions and his apparent willingness to commodify family confidences, had become what institutional analysts call an unacceptable variable. The crown, which has survived civil wars, abdications, and the dissolution of empire, was not about to be destabilized by one man's grievances, however legitimate they might appear to the sympathetic observer. The Prince of Wales understood this with a clarity that apparently escaped his father's more sentimental instincts. William, who has spent his entire life being groomed for the impossible weight of constitutional monarchy, delivered an assessment to King Charles that was as brutal as it was accurate. Every conciliatory gesture, every private phone call, every whispered possibility of rapprochement was being weaponized in the court of public opinion. The Sussex narrative machine, operating from the comfortable distance of Montecito, was effectively bleeding the monarchy's credibility. William's intervention was not that of a jealous brother. It was that of a future king recognizing an existential threat to the institution he will one day embody. The document itself, finalized during that midnight session at Windsor, is a masterwork of constitutional engineering. It doesn't merely establish distance, it creates an unbridgeable chasm. The succession firewall, as it has come to be known among the initiated, ensures that no future monarch, no matter how personally inclined toward mercy or reconciliation, can reverse this decision without an act of Parliament. Think about the implications of that requirement. The Crown has effectively tied its own hands, placing the resolution of this family drama beyond the reach of royal prerogative and into the realm of democratic legislation. This is not anger. This is institutional survival instinct operating at its most refined level. But here is where the narrative becomes truly Shakespearean in its cruelty. The triggering mechanism for this final lockdown was not Harry's departure from royal duties in 2020. It was not the Oprah interview or the Netflix documentaries or even the publication of his memoir. Those were merely symptoms of a deeper pathology that the palace had been monitoring with increasing alarm. The true breaking point came when palace lawyers discovered a pattern of what they termed constitutional reconnaissance. There were quiet inquiries about ceremonial recognition for individuals outside the direct bloodline. There were attempts to redefine what it means to be royal in the modern age, to expand the circle of institutional inclusion based on personal affection rather than hereditary law. Princess Anne, that most unsentimental of Windsor servants, reportedly delivered a warning to her brother that echoed through the private chambers like a death knell. The monarchy, she insisted, is not a social club whose membership criteria can be adjusted to accommodate contemporary sensibilities. It is a covenant, ancient and inviolable, that demands absolute adherence to tradition or accepts total exile. There is no middle ground. There never has been. Anne, who has spent decades subordinating her own considerable intelligence and capability to the demands of institutional protocol, recognized in the Sussex maneuvering something she had seen before in the dying days of other European monarchies: the attempt to modernize without understanding that some institutions survive precisely because they refuse to modernize. The Queen herself, in the final months before her death, had apparently foreseen this crisis with the clarity that comes from 7 decades of reading the tides of public sentiment and institutional necessity. Hidden among her private papers, discovered only after William's legal team began their systematic review of royal precedent, was a handwritten directive that reads like something from a medieval charter. Elizabeth II, grandmother and monarch, had drawn a line through history with her own hand. Any descendant of the Sussex line, she wrote in that unmistakable script, shall be barred from succession or official royal roll. No qualifiers, no escape clauses, no room for the sentimentality that might tempt a future sovereign into undoing what necessity demanded. If you're beginning to understand the magnitude of what has occurred, if you're feeling that cold recognition of power operating beyond the reach of human affection, then stay with this story, because what comes next reveals not just the fate of one prince, but the brutal mathematics by which all great institutions calculate their survival. Subscribe now, because the mechanisms of power rarely reveal themselves with such naked clarity, and you're witnessing constitutional history being written in real time. The true genius of institutional power lies not in its capacity for dramatic gesture, but in its ability to make decisive action appear inevitable, almost natural. The palace's handling of Harry's final exclusion demonstrates this principle with textbook precision. When the Duke of Sussex received notification of Operation Heritage Reset, it came not through the intimacy of a father's phone call or even the courtesy of a private meeting. It arrived through official channels, the same administrative machinery that would notify any government functionary of a change in policy. The cruelty was not in the content, but in the method. The palace was granting Harry exactly what he had claimed to want: privacy and distance, but weaponizing that grant by removing the institutional floor beneath his feet. Consider the exquisite irony of this maneuver. For years, Harry and his wife had constructed a narrative of victimhood centered on the palace's refusal to grant them the privacy and autonomy they deserved. Very well, the institution essentially replied. We grant you that privacy in its most complete and absolute form. You are now private citizens, truly and irrevocably private, with no claim to the machinery of monarchy that once amplified your voice to global significance. The Sussex brand, which had derived its entire commercial and cultural value from proximity to the crown, was suddenly revealed to be utterly dependent on the very institution it claimed to have transcended. The palace understood something that Harry apparently did not. In the modern attention economy, there are countless celebrities, activists, and public figures competing for mindshare. What made the Sussexes unique was not their personal charisma or their advocacy work. It was the Windsor seal, that institutional imprimatur that transformed personal opinion into matter of historical significance. Strip away that seal, and what remains is merely another wealthy couple with opinions, no more or less significant than any other celebrity attempting to leverage fame into influence. William's strategic thinking here reveals a sophistication that should alarm anyone who believes that hereditary monarchy is incompatible with modern political acumen. The Prince of Wales recognized that every attempt at reconciliation, every expression of familial warmth, was being interpreted not as genuine emotion, but as institutional weakness. The Crown's silence, he argued in private briefings, was being mistaken for inability to respond. By maintaining a posture of wounded dignity, the palace was actually ceding the narrative battlefield to those who had no compunction about weaponizing family intimacy for public consumption. The solution was not to engage in a public war of words, which would diminish the monarchy to the level of reality television drama. The solution was to demonstrate, through decisive institutional action, that the Crown operates on a different plane of existence entirely. The succession firewall accomplished this with brutal efficiency. It told the world that the monarchy is not negotiating, it is not mediating, it is not even particularly interested in the personal feelings of its individual members. It is an institution that will outlast all of them, that will continue to function according to its own internal logic, regardless of individual human drama. But the document that formalized Harry's exile accomplished something even more significant than mere exclusion. It redefined the terms of royal relevance for future generations. By explicitly removing Harry's children from any contingency planning, by ensuring that the line of succession flows exclusively through William's offspring, the palace has sent an unmistakable signal about the nature of modern monarchy. This is not a family business in which various branches might claim legitimacy. This is a constitutional mechanism in which clarity of succession trumps all other considerations, including the sentimental attachment to bloodline diversity. The Queen's posthumous directive, that handwritten clause discovered in the Windsor archives, adds a layer of historical weight to this decision that no living monarch could have achieved alone. Elizabeth II, who spent her reign navigating the impossible tension between tradition and modernity, between family and institution, apparently concluded in her final assessment that the monarchy's survival required a hardening of boundaries that her natural inclination toward family cohesion would have resisted. The woman who once welcomed Meghan Markle into the royal fold with apparent genuine warmth had by the end recognized that institutional survival required the sacrifice of personal sentiment. This is the part of the story that should genuinely disturb anyone who believes in the primacy of human connection over institutional necessity. The Queen, who by all accounts adored Harry and took genuine pleasure in his youthful rebelliousness, concluded that the institution she had served for 7 decades demanded his exclusion. She made this judgment not in anger, but in that cold calculation that defines true institutional thinking. And she put it in writing, ensuring that future sovereigns could not undo out of personal affection what necessity demanded. The palace's current posture, that studied silence in response to Sussex provocations, is itself a form of communication. By refusing to engage, by declining to provide the oxygen of official response to personal grievances, the institution is demonstrating a truth that Harry seems unable to accept. The monarchy does not need him. It does not need to defend itself against his accusations. It simply needs to continue existing, to continue performing its constitutional function, and the passage of time will render his criticisms increasingly irrelevant. This is perhaps the most devastating aspect of the final lockdown. It is not a punishment that Harry can fight against or an injustice he can expose. It is simply a door closing quietly and permanently while the machinery of state continues to function without interruption. If you're starting to see the deeper patterns of institutional power at work here, if you're beginning to understand how great institutions outlast individual human dramas, then you need to hear what comes next. Drop a comment below telling us whether you think the monarchy's decision represents cold necessity or unforgivable cruelty, because the answer to that question reveals everything about how power actually operates in our modern world. Subscribe now, because the mechanisms of power rarely reveal themselves with such naked clarity, and you're witnessing constitutional history being written in real time. The final phase of Operation Heritage Reset reveals the monarchy's most sophisticated understanding of modern power dynamics. While Harry sits in Montecito, presumably processing the reality of his institutional erasure, the palace has already moved on to what insiders call the purification protocol. This is not merely about excluding the Sussexes. This is about redefining the visual and conceptual landscape of monarchy for the next generation, ensuring that when the public thinks of royal succession, they see only the direct line running from Charles through William to George, Charlotte, and Louis. Every official photograph, every ceremonial appearance, every carefully staged family moment now serves this singular purpose. The Royal Communications Office has been systematically removing ambiguity from the succession narrative. There are no more casual mentions of extended family members who might in some hypothetical crisis be called upon to serve. There are no more acknowledgments of non-working royals in official documentation. The machinery of monarchy has been streamlined to reflect a simple, unambiguous truth. The Windsor succession runs through one line, and that line is now fortified against all alternatives. This represents a remarkable reversal of the direction royal communications had been taking prior to Harry's departure. There had been movement toward a more inclusive definition of the royal family, toward acknowledging that modern Britain required a modern monarchy that reflected contemporary values of diversity and inclusion. The Sussex crisis has apparently convinced the palace that this direction was fundamentally mistaken. The institution has returned to its historical understanding that its power derives not from reflecting society, but from standing apart from it, from representing continuity and tradition in a world of constant flux. William's children are now being positioned not just as future royals, but as the only future royals who matter. Their education, their public appearances, their gradual introduction to royal duties, all of this is being orchestrated with a clarity of purpose that leaves no room for competing narratives. George, the future king, is being shaped by an institution that has learned from the chaos of the previous generation. He will understand from the earliest age that there is no negotiating with destiny, no opting out of duty, no possibility of a half in, half out royal existence. The succession firewall ensures that this clarity extends beyond the current generation. By legally barring Harry's descendants from any claim to royal status or function, the palace has eliminated the possibility that some future crisis might tempt a sovereign to reach outside the direct line for additional working royals. This is constitutional engineering at its most far-sighted. The institution is protecting not just the current reign, but all future reigns from the kind of instability that the Sussex situation represented. But perhaps the most brutal aspect of this entire operation is how it has redefined Harry's own legacy within the royal historical narrative. The palace archivists, those custodians of official memory, have already begun the subtle process of revision. Harry's contributions during his working royal years are not being erased, but they are being contextualized differently. He is becoming, in the official record, a transitional figure, someone whose ultimate importance lies not in what he accomplished, but in what his departure revealed about the non-negotiable requirements of institutional monarchy. This is how institutions truly punish those who challenge them. Not through dramatic confrontation, but through the slow, patient work of rewriting the historical record. Harry will be remembered, but he will be remembered as the prince who chose personal happiness over duty, who mistook the privileges of royalty for personal entitlement, who failed to understand that the crown is not a birthright that can be negotiated, but a burden that demands everything or grants nothing. The cold finality of this judgment is precisely what makes it so devastating. There is no appeal, no court of public opinion that can reverse an institutional decision of this magnitude. The palace has demonstrated that it can absorb the temporary damage of negative publicity, the short-term crisis of reduced working royal numbers, because it operates on a timescale that transcends individual reigns. The monarchy survived the abdication crisis, the death of Diana, the scandals of the 1990s. It will survive the Sussex departure by the simple expedient of outlasting it. Anne's role in fortifying this position cannot be overstated. The Princess Royal, who has performed more official duties than any other royal family member while maintaining absolute discretion about family matters, represents everything that the institution values and everything that Harry apparently rejected. Her reported warning to Charles that the Sussex situation would end badly unless decisive action was taken was not the advice of a vindictive sister, but the assessment of someone who has spent decades understanding how institutional monarchy actually functions. The covenant that Anne referenced, that ancient understanding between crown and country, requires absolute commitment from those who would claim its privileges. It requires the subordination of personal desire to duty, the acceptance that one's life is not one's own, that every moment is lived in service to something larger than individual happiness. Harry's great mistake in the institutional view was believing that he could negotiate the terms of that covenant, that he could selectively embrace royal privilege while rejecting royal constraint. The final lockdown confirms what the palace has apparently known all along. There is no middle ground in monarchy. You are either fully committed to the institution, accepting all its absurdities and limitations and impossible demands, or you are outside it entirely. The attempt to create some hybrid existence, simultaneously royal and private, was always doomed because it fundamentally misunderstood the nature of constitutional monarchy. The institution cannot bend to accommodate individual preference without ceasing to be what it is. As the gates of Buckingham Palace swing shut for the final time on Prince Harry's royal future, As the legal documents ensure that this closure is permanent and irreversible, we are witnessing something rare in modern politics. We are watching an ancient institution demonstrate that it still possesses the will and the mechanism to enforce its own survival, regardless of the human cost. The crown has made its calculation, the bloodline has been preserved, the succession has been secured, and one prince, once beloved, has been transformed from royal spare into historical warning about the price of institutional defiance. Tell us in the comments whether this represents the necessary ruthlessness of institutional survival or the tragic sacrifice of family to power, because your answer reveals everything about whether the monarchy can truly survive in the modern world it has chosen to defy. If you're starting to see the deeper patterns of institutional power at work here, if you're beginning to understand how great institutions outlast individual human dramas, then you need to hear what comes next. Drop a comment below telling us whether you think the monarchy's decision represents cold necessity or unforgivable cruelty, because the answer to that question reveals everything about how power actually operates in our modern world. Subscribe now, because the mechanisms of power rarely reveal themselves with such naked clarity, and you're witnessing constitutional history being written in real time.